Harlem, October 1946. 14 nightclub owners paid a stranger's tax collector every week while Bumpy Johnson's name was stamped on every envelope without his permission. They had the badges, they had the muscle, but within one night, it all collapsed from the inside. So what did Bumpy do that made the entire syndicate tear itself apart? To find out, we go back to where it began. The rain came down slow and dirty that October night, the kind of rain that stuck to everything: windows, wool coats, the backs of your hands. On 133rd Street, the neon signs bled color into the puddles below, red and blue smearing together like something that had been cut open. Harlem was loud most nights. Jazz spilled out of every doorway. Laughter hit the sidewalk before the door even opened, and the smell of frying chicken and cigarette smoke wrapped around the whole block like a blanket that had never been washed. But that week, underneath all of it, there was a different sound. Quieter. Colder. The sound of money being counted by hands that didn't belong there. It started with envelopes. Clean white envelopes delivered by men in pressed suits who smiled when they handed them over and kept smiling when the club owners opened them. Inside was a number, a weekly number, and a line at the bottom that said, "Simply for continued operation and goodwill. No name signed, no return address. Just the number and the expectation that it would be met." 14 clubs on the north end of Lenox Avenue received one. 3 on 7th, 2 more tucked into the side streets near 135th. The men who delivered them spoke quietly, shook hands firmly, and were gone before the owner could ask a single question. Raymond Chester had owned the Blue Mirror Club for 19 years. He was 61 years old, owed the bank $11,000 on a roof repair he'd financed the previous winter, and had never once missed a payment on anything in his life. When the envelope came, he sat at his own bar after closing, turned it over in his hands 3 times, and set it down without opening it. His bartender, a young man named Curtis who had worked there since he was 17, watched him do it. "You going to open that?" Curtis asked. Raymond looked at it for a long time. "I already know what's in it," he said. The man who had delivered Raymond's envelope was not Italian. He was a compact, well-dressed man named Sol Weiss, half Italian by his mother's side, half Jewish by his father's, and entirely comfortable in the space between 2 worlds that usually didn't share a table. Sol had been arranging introductions between downtown money and uptown establishments for 11 years. He was not cruel. He was not even particularly greedy. He was simply a man who understood that friction cost everyone money, and that his value was in eliminating friction before it started. Sol worked for a structure that had fingers in construction, in numbers, in liquor distribution, and now, apparently, in Harlem nightlife. The structure had decided, somewhere above Sol's pay grade, that the clubs along Lenox Avenue were generating enough cash on weekend nights to justify a formalized arrangement. The word they used internally was partnership. The word the club owners used, in private, when they thought no one was listening, was something else entirely. The local precinct officers knew. 2 of them, a desk sergeant named Briggs and a patrol lieutenant named Eckhart, had been on a separate, quieter payment schedule for years. They knew the names, the routes, the collection days. They knew and they said nothing, because saying something would have required them to explain how long they had already known. And that conversation led nowhere good for anyone wearing a badge. Bumpy Johnson heard about the envelopes on the 2nd day. He heard about them the way he heard about most things, not from someone who came to him directly, but from 3 separate people who each mentioned a piece of it without knowing the others had spoken. A numbers runner who had been approached outside the Blue Mirror. A cook at a restaurant on 134th who had overheard 2 men in the back booth speaking Italian and writing figures on a paper napkin, and a woman named Ida, who cleaned offices on the west side of the neighborhood and whose cousin had received an envelope at his barber shop. Bumpy did not react. He listened, nodded, poured a glass of water, and changed the subject. That same night, he sent 4 people out not to confront anyone, not to collect anything, but simply to observe and record. Who delivered? When? Which clubs? Which owners had already paid? Which had stalled? Which had asked questions and which had gone very quiet? By the end of the 3rd day, he had a list that covered 2 full pages. Every location, every collector, every owner who had bowed first. Historical records from this period are incomplete, but accounts from Harlem residents of the era describe a period of significant pressure on black-owned businesses throughout the mid-1940s. The number that stayed with Bumpy was not the weekly fee printed on the envelopes. It was the total, projected forward, what 14 clubs paying every week for a full year would mean. It was not a robbery. It was a system. Someone downtown had done the arithmetic and decided that Harlem, on paper, was worth more as a tributary than as a territory. He set the list down on the table in front of him and sat with it for a long time without speaking. His associate, a man named Delroy, who had been with him for 8 years, watched him from across the room. "What do you want to do?" Delroy finally asked. Bumpy folded the list carefully along the center crease. "Nothing yet," he said. "A man who moves fast on incomplete information makes noise. I want to know who's impatient. The one pushing hardest isn't the one holding the flag. In that world, power did not knock on your door. It sent you an invoice and waited to see how long it took you to pay." By the time Bumpy's list was complete, one fact had become impossible to ignore. This was not a freelance shakedown. This was not 3 men with ambition and a borrowed car. This was a structured operation with collectors, accountants, legal cover, and police protection. Someone had built a machine, and that machine had been designed, from the beginning, to run directly through Harlem. The back room of Castellano's restaurant on 116th Street smelled like garlic, old wood, and the specific kind of tension that collects in a room where everyone is pretending to be relaxed. The yellow light from the single overhead fixture made every face look like it had already done something wrong and was simply waiting to be asked about it. Bumpy arrived at 9:15, 4 minutes after the agreed time, not enough to be an insult, just enough to be a signal. He wore a dark suit, no tie, and carried nothing. Delroy waited outside in the car. Bumpy walked into that room alone, the way a man walks into a room when he wants everyone in it to understand that he is not afraid of them. 3 men sat at the table. The one who spoke first was a heavy-set man named Caruso, not the top of anything, but the face of this particular arrangement, the one whose name appeared on the envelopes. He stood when Bumpy entered, smiled with his whole face, and extended a hand. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for coming. Please, sit." Bumpy sat. He did not smile. The second man was an accountant named Ferretti, who held a black leather notebook flat on the table in front of him with both hands, as if it might try to leave. He had not looked up when Bumpy entered. He did not look up now. The third man was the one Bumpy had come to see. He sat at the far end of the table, slightly back from it, as if the table itself was beneath his concern. His name was never spoken aloud during that meeting, and accounts of who exactly he was differ, depending on who is telling the story. What was consistent across every version was this: he was older than the other 2. He spoke less than either of them, and every time Caruso made a point, this man either gave the smallest possible nod or did nothing at all. The nods were decisions. The silences were also decisions. Caruso began with food. He offered bread, water, coffee. Bumpy declined all 3. "We want to keep this simple," Caruso said. Nobody is looking for trouble. We have operations. You have operations. There's an overlap that costs both sides money and causes problems that nobody needs. What we're proposing is an arrangement that cleans that up." "What kind of arrangement?" Bumpy asked. Caruso opened his hands. "A weekly contribution, per establishment. We ensure that your venues operate without interference. No inspections, no complications, no problems from outside parties. The clubs keep running. Everyone stays comfortable." "And if a club owner declines," Caruso smiled again, slightly smaller this time. "We'd hope that wouldn't happen. These are businessmen. Businessmen understand the value of stability." Bumpy looked at the accountant's notebook. How were the numbers arrived at? Ferretti finally looked up. He recited 3 figures without being asked: the average weekly gross of a mid-sized Harlem club, the percentage the arrangement would claim, and the net amount expected per venue. He said all 3 in a tone that suggested he had said them many times before, in many rooms, and that the rooms had always eventually agreed. A Wall Street attorney named Hirsch sat in the corner and had said nothing. His function, Bumpy understood immediately, was to make the conversation sound like a contract negotiation rather than a threat. Language was the only thing Hirsch was there to launder. Bumpy leaned back in his chair. He did not cross his arms. He did not lean forward. He simply sat with the posture of a man who had nowhere else to be and no particular investment in how the next hour went. "I'll need to consider it," he said. Caruso nodded. "Of course. We're not asking for an answer tonight." "Good," Bumpy said, "because I don't have one." He stayed 20 more minutes. He asked 2 more questions, both procedural, both designed to make Caruso talk more than he intended to. He watched the old man at the end of the table. He watched when Caruso looked at the old man before answering. He watched when Caruso did not. A smart man does not overturn the table early. He waits to see whose hands are shaking first. When Bumpy stood to leave, Caruso walked him to the door and pressed a sealed envelope into his hand. "Just some background material," Caruso said. "Names of the establishments that have already confirmed their participation, to show you that this is already in motion." Bumpy took the envelope without looking at it. In the car, he opened it. Inside was a typed list of 3 club owners who had agreed to pay. 2 of the names he expected. They were men who bent early under most pressures and would apologize for it afterward. The 3rd name stopped him cold. It was a man named Walter Gaines who had eaten dinner at Bumpy's table less than 2 weeks ago, who had sat across from him and said, without being asked, that the downtown pressure was nothing to worry about. Walter Gaines had opened the door, and he had done it before the meeting had even been arranged. Late-night Harlem had a smell that was entirely its own. Damp cigarettes and stage sweat and the grease from the kitchen exhaust fans that ran until 2 in the morning. The sidewalks held heat longer than they should have, even in October. And the alley behind the Starlight Club on 131st always smelled faintly of spilled bourbon and something older that no one had ever traced to a source. The betrayal had already started rotting before anyone found it. The problem was no longer that the Italians were demanding money. That was a problem with a shape, a set of names, a structure that could be mapped and addressed. The new problem was interior. Someone inside Harlem's own network was feeding information downtown which cashiers handled the largest Friday takes, which owners had debt that made them soft, which nights were heavy enough to make the collection worth the trip. This was not guesswork from the outside. This was knowledge that could only come from someone who had stood inside the rooms. A young club manager named Darnell Price had been working the floor at 3 different venues over the past year, filling in for a regular at the Starlight, running the door 2 nights a week at the Blue Mirror, picking up weekend shifts at a private room on 134th that didn't advertise its name. He was 26, well-dressed, and had a way of making himself useful just slightly faster than anyone thought to ask. He remembered everything: schedules, amounts, names, habits. He kept none of it written down, because he didn't need to. A woman named Gloria Reeves sang 5 nights a week at the Starlight. She had been singing professionally since she was 19 and had learned the way all performers eventually learn, that the people who pay the least attention to you hear the most. She heard conversations between sets, during sound checks, through the thin wall between the dressing room and the manager's office. She was not a spy. She was simply a woman who listened well and had very good memory, and who had recently begun to understand that certain people were very interested in what she remembered. There was also a driver. His name was Carl Dupree, and he moved cash between venues in a plain black Ford on Tuesday and Thursday nights. He was reliable and discreet and had been doing the route for 2 years without incident. He also owed $400 to a lender connected, through 2 intermediaries, to the same downtown structure that was now sending envelopes. Bumpy knew about Carl's debt within 48 hours of starting to look. He did not move on it immediately. Instead, he built a false route. He told 3 people separately, with different details, that a large cash transfer would be moving from the Starlight to a holding location on Wednesday night instead of Thursday. Different times, different pickup points. Each version of the story was slightly different, just enough that if the information leaked, he would be able to trace which version had reached the other side. Stories passed down through Harlem communities often blend fact and legend, but the period's patterns of internal surveillance were widely documented by later historians. He then waited. On Wednesday night, a car sat parked on the corner of 131st and 7th Avenue for 40 minutes beginning at 10 o'clock. 2 men inside, engine off, neither of them from Harlem. The car matched the version of the story that Bumpy had told only to Carl Dupree. Bumpy received the report at 11:15. He sat with it for a long time without speaking, the way he had sat with the original list of club owners. Then he folded the paper, put it in his jacket pocket, and poured himself a glass of water. Carl Delroy asked from across the room. "Carl," Bumpy confirmed. He did not sound angry. He sounded like a man who had finished a calculation and arrived at the number he had expected. He did not move against Carl that night, not because he was being merciful, but because Carl was now more useful in place than removed. A confirmed leak could be fed, and a fed leak could be used to move the other side exactly where Bumpy needed them to go. In the game of power, betrayal does not begin with a gun. It begins with a memory that is too precise, in a room where it should have gone unnoticed. The false convoy had been intercepted exactly on schedule, right time, right location, right detail. But the men sitting in that parked car were not wearing rings. They were wearing badges, and that meant the pipeline between Harlem's inside and the downtown structure did not run only through Carl Dupree. It ran through the precinct as well, and the 2 ends of that pipeline, Bumpy now understood, were connected at a point he had not yet located. He looked at Delroy. "We have more than one door open," he said. "How many?" Bumpy set his glass down. "That's what we're going to find out." The police siren cut through the rain at midnight, like someone had decided the night needed a formal announcement. On 134th Street, 2 patrol officers stood outside the entrance of a club called the Marquee. Flashlights pointed at the face of a man named Ernest Webb, who was sitting on the wet pavement, holding a cloth to his mouth. The cloth was dark red. Ernest was 53 years old and had owned the Marquee for 11 years without a single violation on record. The officers took notes. They asked questions. They wrote nothing useful down. By 1 in the morning, they were gone. By 1:15, the collector who had put Ernest on the pavement was 3 blocks away, dry and unhurried, counting the evening's take in the back seat of a car that no one had stopped. Bumpy heard the full account before sunrise. He already knew about Sergeant Briggs and Lieutenant Eckhart. He had known about them for 2 weeks, known that they received payments, knew the schedule, knew which nights they made themselves scarce so that the collections could proceed without interference. That was corruption of a kind Harlem had lived with for a long time. It was ugly but predictable. Predictable things could be managed. What he had not known, until the night Ernest Webb bled on his own sidewalk, was that the arrangement had been formalized. The officers were not simply looking away. They were coordinating. Briggs had been rotating patrol assignments on collection nights, pulling his own men off certain blocks and replacing them with officers from a different precinct who had been briefed to respond slowly. It was a schedule, a system. The same word kept coming back. A reporter named Marcus Hale worked the crime desk at a small paper that covered Harlem and Upper Manhattan. He was 38. Ambitious in the specific way of a man who had been passed over for a larger paper twice and had decided to make the smaller one matter through sheer force of will. He had been trying to crack a story about precinct corruption for 4 months and had enough pieces to know the shape of it, but not enough to print. Bumpy sent him an envelope. Inside was a single typewritten page describing the patrol rotation on the night of Ernest Webb's beating shift assignments. Badge numbers, the name of the officer who had called the early departure. No source named, no return address, just the facts, laid out in the flat language of someone who had been keeping careful records. Marcus Hale ran the story 6 days later. It named Briggs by rank but not by name, described the rotation system in enough detail to be alarming, and quoted 2 unnamed club owners who confirmed that collections had taken place on nights when the usual patrol was absent. It was not a killing blow. It was a bruise visible enough to cause discomfort, specific enough to demand an internal response. Accounts of police involvement in Harlem's protection rackets during this era have been partially corroborated by municipal records examined by researchers decades later. Briggs called in sick for 3 consecutive days after the story ran. Eckhart requested a transfer to a different division, which was denied. 2 other officers who had been part of the rotation quietly stopped answering their secondary phone numbers. The machine did not stop, but it developed a tremor, and tremors made people careless. A local judge named Calloway owed Bumpy a favor from 1943, not money, not violence. Just information that had arrived at the right moment and had kept Calloway's name out of a proceeding that would have ended his career. Calloway had never been asked to repay it. Men in Calloway's position lived in low-grade fear of the day they would be. Bumpy called him on a Thursday afternoon and asked for nothing except confirmation that a particular case file had been properly logged. Calloway confirmed it within the hour, in a voice that suggested he understood the call was also a reminder that the debt still existed. The tremor spread. Then, on a Friday evening, Delroy set a black ledger on the table in front of Bumpy without saying a word. It had been recovered from Ferretti's accountant office, not taken by force, but photographed page by page by a cleaning woman who had been given a camera and very specific instructions about which drawer to open and how long she had before the office was occupied again. The photographs had been developed, and the relevant pages printed out and assembled into this single document. Bumpy opened it. The ledger ran 43 pages. The first 30 were what he expected: club names, weekly amounts, collection dates, running totals, clean bookkeeping for a dirty operation. He read through it with the focus of a man checking figures on a contract, turning pages at an even pace, his face showing nothing. On page 31, the column headers changed. There was a new category. It appeared above 12 separate line items, each corresponding to a different club or business. The category was labeled, in Ferretti's cramped handwriting, with 2 initials and a street name that left no ambiguity about who it referred to. Bumpy's name, his territory, his reputation listed as a line item, as justification, as the reason 14 club owners had not simply refused and called for help. The collectors had not been presenting themselves as downtown muscle. They had been telling the owners that the arrangement had Bumpy Johnson's approval, that he had agreed, that this was, in fact, his operation being run through them. The envelopes stamped with his name were not forgeries meant to confuse. They were a deliberate fiction meant to neutralize resistance before it started. Every owner who had paid in part because they believed Bumpy had already consented. Every owner who had hesitated had been told that pushing back meant pushing back against Bumpy himself. He had been used as a wall to keep his own people inside. Bumpy closed the ledger. He set both hands flat on the cover and sat with the silence for a full minute. Delroy stood against the far wall and did not speak. When the law takes dirty money, justice becomes a performance staged for people who can't afford better seats. How long has this been running? Bumpy finally asked. Best estimate, Delroy said, since before the first envelope, maybe 2 months before. Bumpy nodded once. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the street below. A woman was walking a dog. A man was locking up a hardware store. The neighborhood looked exactly like itself. They didn't just want Harlem's money, he said. They wanted Harlem to think its own man had already sold it. The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something has just changed permanently, and everyone present knows it, but no one has said it out loud yet. Bumpy sat at the head of the table with the ledger open in front of him. Delroy stood near the door. A man named Theodore Cross, who had advised Bumpy on financial matters for 6 years, and whose opinion Bumpy had trusted on decisions that involved serious money, sat 2 chairs to the left and had not moved in several minutes. The numbers in the ledger were not the shock. The shock was the architecture behind them. Bumpy read the relevant pages a second time, more slowly. The operation had not been designed to extract money from Harlem clubs and disappear. It had been designed to extract money from Harlem clubs and leave behind a specific narrative that Bumpy Johnson had partnered with downtown interests, that he had traded Harlem's independence for a cut, that the protection tax was his idea run through their infrastructure. If anyone ever pushed back hard enough to cause real trouble, the ledger itself would surface. And the ledger told a story where Bumpy was not a victim. He was the architect. The man who built this had not been trying to take Harlem. He had been trying to take Bumpy's name, attach it to the operation like a signature, and then step back and let the signature do the work. This is a frame, Bumpy said. Theodore nodded slowly. A clean one. Who funded the setup costs? Someone floated the first 2 months of collections before it turned profitable. Theodore was quiet for a moment. There's a lender in the Bronx. Commercial real estate on the surface. The startup capital for this kind of operation. The suits. The lawyers. The precinct payments that's $50,000 before you see a return. That doesn't come from downtown alone. A man named Roy Sims had been bringing Bumpy information from multiple directions for 3 years. Roy was not loyal to any one side. He was loyal to the value of being in the middle, which meant he told partial truths to several parties and survived on the gaps between them. He had told Bumpy 2 weeks ago that the downtown operation had outside backing but had named no one specifically, citing uncertainty. The uncertainty had been calculated. Bumpy looked at Theodore. Did you know about the Bronx money? Theodore met his eyes. I heard a name connected to it. I didn't bring it to you because I wasn't certain. The silence that followed was different from the one before it. It had an edge. You didn't bring it to me, Bumpy said, or you brought it to someone else first. Theodore said nothing. And the nothing was its own answer. Old men on Lenox Avenue used to say that a king is most dangerous the moment he realizes his throne has wheels. Bumpy had built his operation on the assumption that the people closest to him were extensions of his judgment. He had never fully accounted for the possibility that his judgment itself, his reputation, his name, his years of careful positioning could be detached from him and used by someone else as a separate instrument. Some of the individuals described in accounts from this period used aliases or intermediaries, making complete attribution difficult for historians reviewing the record. The man who had actually constructed the framework was not Italian. He was not downtown. He was a black intermediary named Clarence Fitch, who had spent 8 years positioning himself as a bridge between Harlem's informal economy and the larger structures that surrounded it. Fitch had worked adjacent to Bumpy's operation for most of that time, not inside it. Never directly employed, but close enough to understand its pressure points, its dependencies, its vulnerabilities. Fitch had taken that knowledge to the Bronx lender, proposed the operation, guaranteed it using Bumpy's name as collateral, and built an architecture that was designed to either profit indefinitely or, if exposed, redirect all consequences toward Harlem and away from himself. The clue that led Bumpy to Fitch came from Roy Sims, who finally offered the complete version of what he knew not out of loyalty. But because Fitch had stopped paying him, and Roy had decided that the more valuable move was to be the one who delivered the answer, Roy named the Bronx lender, described 2 meetings he had personally witnessed between Fitch and Ferretti, and confirmed that Fitch had access to Bumpy's operational calendar through a contact whose name Roy declined to provide. Bumpy listened to all of it without interrupting. The most expensive thing power costs you is the day you find out your name has been used as someone else's collateral. When Roy finished, Bumpy thanked him briefly and told him to go home. Then he sat alone in the room for a long time, looking at the ledger, looking at the name that wasn't his but had been written there to function as his. He had spent years making his name mean something specific in Harlem. Reliability, consequence, the understanding that what he said would happen, and what he protected would stay protected. Someone had studied that meaning carefully, understood its market value, and borrowed against it without asking. The problem was no longer the Italians. The problem was Clarence Fitch. And the problem with Clarence Fitch was that removing him quietly solved nothing because the ledger already existed, and the ledger told a story, and stories survived the people in them. Bumpy needed to rewrite the ending before anyone else published the first draft. The cold came in off the river that night with a particular kind of intention, moving through the alleys on 131st Street like it had somewhere specific to be. Trash paper lifted off the pavement and turned slow circles under the streetlights. A cat sat on a fire escape 3 floors up and watched the street below with the flat patience of something that understood how nights like this ended. Harlem knew, not in the way of a formal announcement, but in the way a neighborhood always knows when the pressure that has been building underground is about to find a surface to push through. People came home earlier. Conversations on stoops ended faster. The usual Friday crowd at the Blue Mirror was down by 1/3. Bumpy had a problem with no clean solution. If he moved against the operation with visible force, if men got hurt, if property was destroyed, if the streets filled with the kind of noise that brought cameras and reporters, then every piece of the fiction Fitch had constructed would appear to be confirmed. Bumpy Johnson, retaliating against an operation that bore his name, looked, from the outside, exactly like a power struggle within his own organization. The frame would hold, the ledger would surface, and Harlem would pay the price for being the location of a war that had been designed to happen here. If he did nothing, or too little, the clubs would keep paying. The owners who had already bent would bend further. The ones still holding out would watch the ones who had paid continue to operate without incident. and they would make the arithmetic calculation that paying was simply the cost of staying open. And once that calculation became normal, it would never stop being normal. A pastor named Reverend Aldous Greer ran a church on 129th Street and had been a quiet presence at the edge of Harlem's informal power structure for 20 years. He was not naive about what Bumpy was or what Bumpy did. He was also not a man who pretended that the neighborhood existed in a condition it did not exist in. He came to Bumpy on a Saturday morning, sat down without being invited, and said what he came to say directly. "I need to know if this is going to bleed into the congregation," Reverend Greer said. "I have people who walk past those clubs every night. I need to know what's coming." "Nothing is coming that you'll see from the street," Bumpy told him. "That's not the same as nothing coming." "No," Bumpy agreed. "It isn't." The 3 club owners who had been sitting on the fence, men who had received envelopes, had not paid, had not refused, had simply been waiting to see which direction the weight fell came to, Bumpy separately, in the same 48-hour period. Each of them asked the same question, in different words. Was Bumpy still the man they should be waiting on? Or had something changed that he wasn't telling them? A young man named Deshaun Price, no relation to the club manager Darnell. Though the neighborhood had noticed the shared surname and drawn its own conclusions, had been with Bumpy's outer circle for 2 years. He was 24, fast, and operated on the specific energy of someone who had decided that being useful to the right person was the fastest path available to him. He had asked Delroy 3 times in 1 week if Bumpy was going to move. Each time, Delroy had told him to wait. Each time, Deshaun had waited with the visible strain of a spring being compressed past its comfortable limit. Bumpy understood the pressure. He also understood that a man who fires his weapon before the target is fully in position guarantees only noise. Neighborhood oral histories from this period often describe a sense of community tension that preceded significant shifts in local power structures, though specific events are frequently compressed or conflated in the retelling. He moved on 3 fronts simultaneously, none of them visible from the outside. The first was financial. He sent word to 7 club owners that their outstanding debts to his organization, small amounts, most of them, accumulated over months of short payments and deferred balances, were cleared. Immediately. No conditions. He also returned, in cash, a portion of what 3 owners had already paid to the downtown collectors. Not all of it. Enough to make a point about whose money it actually was and who had the standing to return it. The second was logistical. Carl Dupree's car was found parked outside his apartment building on a Tuesday morning with a flat tire on every wheel and a folded piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. The paper had no writing on it. It didn't need any. Carl understood what a blank page from Bumpy Johnson meant. He called in sick that day and the next, and did not return to the cash route. The third was the supply chain. The downtown collectors moved their cash to a consolidation point in Lower Manhattan through a single trucking company that handled other legitimate freight as cover. Bumpy knew the company, knew the route, and knew the 2 drivers who ran it. He made 2 phone calls. The trucking company developed a sudden and severe scheduling conflict that delayed their Harlem-connected pickups by an indefinite period. No confrontation, no threats, just an absence where a service used to be. Wanting to keep a kingdom sometimes means paying for loyalty before you demand it. The 3 fence-sitting club owners received their answers not through any statement Bumpy made, but through what they observed over the following 4 days. Debts cleared, money returned, the cash route disrupted, and not a single incident, not a raised voice, not a single broken window anywhere in the neighborhood. The operation looked, from the inside, like it was being quietly suffocated by someone who knew exactly which tube to pinch. But Fitch and the men downtown read it differently. They watched the gestures toward the club owners and saw what they wanted to see: a man trying to buy back loyalty he had already lost, making concessions because he had no harder option available. They saw softness where there was precision. They saw retreat where there was redirection. And so they made a decision. If Bumpy was weakening, this was the moment to end it cleanly. One sharp action, aimed at the center of what Harlem associated with his protection, public enough to make the lesson impossible to ignore. They chose the Starlight Club on a Friday night, the busiest night, the most people, the place where Gloria Reeves sang and where Harlem came to feel like itself. They chose it because hitting it would not just cost money, it would cost faith. And faith, once publicly shaken, was harder to rebuild than any dollar amount. Bumpy found out about the plan on a Thursday afternoon, with less than 30 hours to respond. He did not panic. He picked up the phone. Gloria Reeves was 3 bars into the second verse when the front window of the Starlight Club exploded inward. The sound was not like thunder. It was sharper than that, more specific. The kind of sound that the human body recognizes before the mind catches up. Glass hit the floor in a single wave. The trumpet player stopped first, then the bass, then the room. All at once, went from loud to a silence so complete that the only thing left was the ringing in everyone's ears and the smell of gunpowder drifting in through the broken frame. 2 shots had come through the window. One buried itself in the back wall above the bar. The other caught a man named Leonard Price in the left shoulder as he was turning toward the stage. Leonard was 51 years old, a retired postal worker who came to the Starlight every Friday without exception. He went down between 2 bar stools and did not get up. The room emptied in under 90 seconds. People moved for the back exit, the side door, the kitchen, the alley. Chairs fell. Glasses shattered on the floor. A woman lost a shoe and kept running anyway. The band was off the stage before the last note had finished dying in the air. Gloria did not run immediately. She stood at the edge of the stage for 3 full seconds, long enough to see the man standing on the sidewalk outside the broken window. He was not the shooter. The shooter was already gone. This man was the one who had given the signal, a slight drop of the left hand, palm down, the kind of gesture that looked like nothing unless you were watching for it. He was wearing a gray coat, no hat, and he had the flat expression of someone completing a task rather than committing a crime. Gloria looked at his face for 3 seconds. Then she ran. A doctor named Edmund Carr ran what amounted to an unofficial clinic out of a second-floor apartment on 132nd Street. He treated wounds that people could not explain at a hospital without attracting the kind of attention that ended careers, relationships, and occasionally lives. He had been doing it for 9 years. Leonard Price was brought to him by 2 men within 20 minutes of the shooting. Edmund removed the bullet, packed the wound, told Leonard to stay still for 6 hours, and sent word to Bumpy before he washed his hands. A small gang leader named Victor Reese operated 3 blocks from the Starlight and had been watching the downtown operation with the focused interest of a man calculating whether the wind was shifting in a direction he could use. Victor had paid nothing, refused nothing, and said nothing, which was its own kind of position. When the shots came through the Starlight window, Victor made a decision. He sent a message to the other side that same night, indicating he was available for a conversation about new arrangements. Bumpy received the report on Leonard, the report on Victor, and Gloria's description of the man in the gray coat within 2 hours of each other. He did not move on Victor immediately. A man who changes allegiance that fast in response to a single incident will change it again the next time the wind shifts. Victor was noted, filed, and set aside. He did not send anyone to find the shooter. The shooter was a tool, not a decision-maker. Finding the tool told him nothing he didn't already know about who had picked it up. What he did instead was call every club owner on his list, the ones who had paid, the ones who hadn't, the ones who were still deciding, and tell each of them the same thing. He was coming to see them personally, not to threaten, not to negotiate, to make a decision together about what kind of neighborhood they were going to operate in when the sun came up Monday morning. Over the following 36 hours, Bumpy sat across from 11 different men in 11 different back rooms, offices, and kitchens. He told each of them what had happened at the Starlight. He told each of them that Leonard Price, who had never been involved in any of this, was recovering in a room on 132nd Street because someone downtown had decided that fear was more efficient than persuasion. He told them that the choice in front of them was not between paying and not paying. The choice was between belonging to Harlem or belonging to whoever sent the next envelope. Violence doesn't always aim to kill. Sometimes it's only there to teach a room full of people how to lower their heads. 9 of the 11 men made their position clear before Bumpy left. 2 asked for more time. Bumpy gave them 48 hours and meant it. He also reorganized the protection routes that night, redistributed which venues were covered, by which people. Changed the timing of the rounds, moved 3 of his most reliable men to the Starlight specifically, and told them to be visible. Not hidden. Visible. He wanted anyone watching from the outside to count the bodies and do the arithmetic. Gloria Reeves came to Bumpy on Sunday afternoon. She sat in the same chair where Roy Sims had sat a week earlier and described the man in the gray coat with a precision that came from genuine memory rather than reconstruction. The face, the coat, the gesture, the direction he had walked after the window broke. Bumpy listened to all of it twice. The man Gloria described was not Fitch. He was not Caruso. He was a logistics coordinator for the operation, the man who scheduled the collections, managed the route timing, and communicated between the downtown structure and the local collectors. His name was Anthony Rullo, and he worked out of a social club on the east side of Manhattan that also served as an informal meeting point for the operation's senior members. More importantly, Gloria had seen which direction Rullo had walked after the signal. She had seen him get into a car parked on the cross street. She had seen the car turn north rather than south, which meant he had not gone back to Manhattan. He had gone somewhere in Harlem. Somewhere close. Bumpy knew of one location that the operation used in Harlem for internal meetings, a warehouse space near the river, used for consolidating cash before it moved downtown. He had known about it for 2 weeks and had not moved on it because it had been, until now, more useful as a known location than as a target. He sent 2 men to watch it that night. By Sunday evening, he had confirmation. The warehouse was occupied, multiple cars outside, the kind of gathering that did not happen unless something significant was being decided. Bumpy looked at Delroy. "They're settling accounts," he said. "Something went wrong with the Starlight, and now they're in there trying to figure out who owns the problem. You want to move on it tonight?" "Not the way you mean," Bumpy said. He picked up the ledger from the table and held it for a moment. "I want them to know we know where they are, and I want them to know it before the meeting ends." The warehouse sat 4 blocks from the river on a street that smelled permanently of diesel fuel and standing water. The building had been used for legitimate storage until 1943, when the original owner had taken a bank loan he couldn't service, and the note had been quietly acquired by interests that found the location more useful for its privacy than its square footage. The loading dock faced away from the street. The windows on the upper level had been painted over from the inside. From the outside, at night, it looked abandoned. Inside, 5 men sat around a folding table under a single work light that turned everyone's face the color of old wax. Caruso was there. Ferretti was there with his black notebook, though he had not opened it. A man named DeLuca, who was 2 levels below the silent elder from Castellano's restaurant and had been the one coordinating the street-level operations, sat with his jacket still on and both hands visible on the table in the posture of someone demonstrating that he was not reaching for anything. Sergeant Briggs sat in a chair slightly away from the table, as if the distance gave him deniability, and Clarence Fitch sat at the far end, very still, watching everyone else. The Starlight shooting had not gone as planned. The intent had been property damage and visible disruption, broken glass. Empty club. A message delivered in a language the whole neighborhood could read. Leonard Price had not been part of the plan. A wounded civilian changed the nature of the event entirely. It created a record. It created a victim with a name and an address and a doctor who had treated him. It created a story that was harder to contain than a broken window. DeLuca had called the meeting. He was 44 years old and had survived 12 years in this business by understanding exactly when a situation was moving from manageable to catastrophic, and by moving faster than the situation. The shooting was not authorized at the level it happened. DeLuca said, "Rouleau exceeded what he was told to do. That's a problem we own, and we need to decide how we handle it." Rouleau followed the intent, Fitch said quietly. The window was supposed to send a message. It sent one. The intent was a broken window, not a man in a doctor's apartment with a bullet in him. There is a difference between those two things, and the difference has a name, and it's not ours to manage. Briggs shifted in his chair. "I need to know what the exposure looks like on my end. If this goes anywhere official, I need to know it's contained." Fitch looked at Briggs with the expression of someone watching a clock run down. "Your exposure is whatever you've already created. That hasn't changed tonight." And Caruso had been quiet for most of the meeting. He spoke now, addressing DeLuca directly. "What is the actual status of the operation before we discuss the shooting?" DeLuca opened a folder. 3 routes disrupted. The trucking arrangement is suspended indefinitely. I'm told the company had a conflict that may not resolve. Collection from 7 venues has stopped in the last week. We're down approximately 40% of projected weekly intake. The room absorbed this. "Johnson did that without a single public move," Caruso said. It was not a question. It carried the tone of a man revising an estimate upward. Ferretti finally opened his notebook. He turned to a specific page and set it face up on the table without explaining why. Everyone who looked at it understood. The page showed the projected returns for the next 6 months against the actual returns for the past 3 weeks. The gap between the two numbers was the kind of gap that ended business arrangements. Historians examining organized crime operations from this era have noted that financial pressure, rather than violence, was frequently the mechanism that caused such arrangements to collapse. Fitch understood what was happening before anyone said it. Caruso was preparing to recommend withdrawal. DeLuca was preparing to let him. Briggs was preparing to disappear as completely as a man with a badge and a paper trail could manage. And Ferretti, who had never been anything but a recorder of what other men decided, was already turning the page. That left Fitch holding an operation that had been designed with his fingerprints on the architecture and everyone else's names on the exits. He had one move. He had known for 2 days that he might need to use it, which was why he had spent those 2 days preparing to offer it. "I can give you Johnson," Fitch said. The room went still. Not the man. The ledger narrative. "I have documentation that supports the original framing that this operation ran with his knowledge and partial direction. If that surfaces in the right place, through the right channel, everything that's happened becomes his problem to explain rather than ours to contain." DeLuca looked at him for a long time. "You're describing burning a man to cover a retreat. I'm describing an exit that leaves the structure intact." What Fitch did not know was that the conversation was already over. Not because anyone at the table had decided to stop him, but because a folded piece of paper had been slipped under the warehouse's side door 40 minutes into the meeting by a man who had been watching the building since Sunday evening. The paper had been picked up by the youngest man in the room, a driver who had been waiting near the door, and passed to DeLuca without comment. DeLuca had read it, refolded it, and set it in his jacket pocket. He had not changed his expression. The paper contained 3 things: a copy of the page from Ferretti's ledger that showed Bumpy's name used as operational cover, a second document showing the Bronx lender's connection to the startup capital, and a single typed line at the bottom that read, "This has been shared with Marcus Hale at the paper. Publication pending your next move. The peak of power is not pulling the trigger. It is making every man in the room believe he needs to pull his first." DeLuca stood up. "The operation is suspended. Effective tonight. Collections stop. Routes close. Anyone still holding cash from Harlem venues returns it through the trucking company when the schedule resumes. No deductions." He looked at Briggs. "Your arrangement is finished. I'd suggest you spend the next week being very visible doing very legitimate things." He looked at Fitch last. "You don't get to burn anyone. You get to go home. That's the offer." Fitch sat very still for a moment. Then he nodded once. Slowly. The way a man nods when he understands that the room has already decided, and that his only remaining choice is how he leaves it. Caruso was already putting on his coat when the warehouse emptied 40 minutes later. Bumpy's 2 men outside counted the departures. 5 men had gone in. 5 came out. No one was carried. No one was running. Bumpy received the report at midnight. He read it once, set it down, and poured himself a glass of water. "It's done," Delroy asked. "The meeting is done," Bumpy said. "Now we find out if the decision holds." The dawn came up gray and slow that Monday morning, the kind of light that arrives without committing to anything, turning the rooftops of Lenox Avenue the color of old newspaper. Trash moved in the gutter. A dog crossed 131st Street at its own pace, unhurried, as if it had already assessed the morning and decided it posed no particular threat. Inside the blue mirror, Raymond Chester was setting chairs off the tables at 6:15 in the morning, the way he had done every morning for 19 years. He moved through the room in the half-dark, his hands finding each chair by habit, his mind somewhere else. Curtis, his bartender, was behind the bar running a cloth over the counter in slow circles. Neither of them spoke for a long time. "You hear anything?" Curtis finally asked. "I heard enough," Raymond said. He set the last chair down and stood in the center of his own floor, looking at the room around him. "I heard it's over." The machine had not collapsed overnight with a single loud event. It had stopped the way most things stop gradually, then completely. The components separating from each other as each person involved made the individual calculation that the cost of continuing had exceeded the benefit of whatever they had expected to gain. DeLuca's instruction had moved through the network quickly. Collections scheduled for Monday did not happen. The 2 remaining collectors who had not yet received word showed up at their first stops and found the owners standing in open doorways with nothing to hand over and expressions that did not invite conversation. Both collectors left without incident. Ferretti's notebook disappeared. Whether he destroyed it or simply moved it somewhere, it would never be found. No one who was asked later claimed to know. The black ledger that had listed Bumpy's name as operational cover remained in Bumpy's possession, locked in a location known only to him and Delroy. Briggs took 3 days of personal leave and returned to work on Thursday, walking with the specific, careful manner of a man who has decided that the most important thing he can do is appear unremarkable. He never spoke publicly about the arrangement. He never spoke privately about it either, not in any conversation that anyone reported. He served out the remainder of his career in a precinct on the far west side and retired in 1952 without incident. Clarence Fitch left Harlem. Not dramatically, no midnight departure. No packed car. No visible urgency. He simply stopped being present in the places where he had previously been present. A week after the warehouse meeting, his apartment on 138th Street had a new occupant. The business connections he had maintained as bridges between uptown and downtown quietly dissolved. The way business connections do when the man at the center of them stops returning messages. Victor Reese, who had sent his message of availability to the other side on the night of the Starlight shooting, received a visit from two of Bumpy's men on Tuesday morning. The visit was brief and entirely conversational. Nothing was broken. No one was hurt. Victor understood by the end of it that his message had been received, that its contents were known, and that the appropriate response at this juncture was a very sustained period of making himself useful in ways that did not involve realigning his interests. Victor agreed immediately and with visible sincerity. Raymond Chester received an envelope on Tuesday afternoon. Inside was the exact amount he had paid to the collectors across the full duration of the operation, every weekly payment, totaled. No note, no explanation. Just the money. In cash. The right amount to the dollar. He sat at his bar with it in front of him for a long time before he put it in the register. Those who documented this period later noted that the full details of how the operation was dismantled were never formally recorded, as was common with disputes of this nature that resolved without public incident. The Starlight Club reopened on Wednesday evening. Gloria Reeves was on stage at 9 o'clock, same as every Wednesday. The trumpet player beside her, the bass behind her. The room filled to the same comfortable capacity it had always been. The front window had been replaced with new glass that caught the neon from across the street and threw it back in clean lines across the floor. Leonard Price was not there. He was still recovering on 132nd Street. But he sent word through his nephew that he'd be back the following Friday. He had not missed a Friday at the Starlight in 6 years, and he did not intend to start now. Bumpy was not at the Starlight that Wednesday. He was at a diner on 125th Street. Sitting across a corner table from 3 of the club owners who had been the last to commit, the ones who had asked for 48 hours and had used them well. The conversation lasted 90 minutes and covered nothing dramatic. Terms, expectations, the understanding of what Harlem's informal economy required from the people who operated inside it and what it provided in return. The 3 men left with clear heads and clear arrangements. Bumpy stayed at the table after they were gone. He drank a second cup of coffee and watched the street through the window. A city bus stopped at the corner, let 3 people off, took on 2 more, and moved on. A woman in a red coat stood at the newsstand and read the front page without buying the paper. A boy on a bicycle took the corner too fast and corrected without falling. Delroy sat down across from him. "It held," he said. "For now." Bumpy said, "You think they'll try again?" Bumpy looked at his coffee. "Someone always tries again. That's not the question." He looked up. "The question is whether they remember what the last attempt cost, and whether they decide that the cost is worth another round." He set his cup down and pushed back his chair. The most durable power is the kind that doesn't need to announce itself a second time. The tax network was gone. The roots belonged to Harlem again. The clubs opened on their own schedules, counted their own money, and paid what they owed to the structure that had always governed them, not because they had no choice, but because that structure had just demonstrated, in the clearest possible terms, what it meant when it said it protected them. A few men had lived through the operation with their bodies intact and their understanding permanently revised. They carried that revision downtown with them, and the revision was specific. Harlem could be tested. The lesson was not that it couldn't be touched. The lesson was that touching it carried a price that had no ceiling, and that the price was collected not through noise and fire but through the quiet, methodical dismantling of everything the person touching it had built. That was the message. Harlem did not need to repeat it. Power that lasts is the kind that never has to explain itself twice. When the smoke cleared, the clubs reopened. The music came back. The money stopped flowing out of Harlem like blood from a wound that no one was supposed to notice. The men who had built the tax machine went home, quieter than they had arrived, carrying a lesson they had not enrolled to learn. But here is what stays with you. Bumpy Johnson never raised his voice, never fired a single shot. He simply made it more expensive to keep going than to walk away. And that, in the end, is a kind of power that most people never see coming until it is already finished. If this story reached something in you, stay close, there are more nights like this one waiting. And we would love to hear from you. Which moment in tonight's story hit you the hardest? And do you think a man like Bumpy Johnson was protecting Harlem, or simply running it on his own terms?